I want to begin this talk on the real pirates of the Caribbean by asking you a few questions. Oh, nobody likes that idea. But there is no right or wrong answer to these questions. Okay? The question is, the first question, when I say pirate, what comes to your mind? What image? What thoughts? What, yes? Johnny Depp. I knew it was going to be Johnny Depp. Yes, he captured the imagination, didn't he, in that role as Jack Sparrow. What else? What else comes to mind?
Blackbeard.
Sorry?
Blackbeard.
Blackbeard, yes, absolutely. Another major figure. I will say more about him later. I have an image of him to show you, in fact. What else? What? Treasure Island. Very famous novel. Because, and it's important because with that novel, pirates entered children's literature and children's culture. And so therefore, people grow up with pirates, with images of pirates. What else? Anything else? What characteristics of pirates do you think about? Like, what kind of people were they? What do they look like, except for Johnny Depp? What do they look like in your mind's eye? I'm sure everyone has seen an image of a pirate with an eye patch, right? With an eye patch. Very common. How about a hook instead of a hand, right? How about a peg leg? Yes? And sometimes even a parrot, a bird sitting on the shoulder. Am I right? This is the very common image of the pirate in popular culture. Now, other characteristics of pirates are, one, they are violent. Yes? They're fearsome. Two, they are greedy. Right? They want gold and silver. Okay? So these are the images that are out there in popular culture. And the pirate is a tremendously important figure in popular culture in the United States and around the world. You've all seen the famous black flag of piracy, right? With the skull and the crossbones, right? I went to Mombasa, Kenya, walking down the street, and there's a bar with the Jolly Roger flag, the black flag with the skull and the crossbones. These things are all around the world. So to me, it's a very interesting sign that pirates mean a lot to us. Their imagery, their symbolism is very important to us. Okay? So the question is, why? Why do we love them so much? I first wrote a scholarly article about pirates and published it in 1981. What's that? 33 years ago, right? Well, ever since I published the first article, the phone never stopped ringing. I got calls from novelists. I got calls from playwrights. I got calls from journalists. I got calls from treasure hunters. I love those calls the most. Because if I get a call from a treasure hunter, I know immediately that they didn't read my book. Because one of the conclusions of my book is that pirates didn't bury their treasure. Because they wanted to spend the money. They didn't believe in deferring gratification, right? They didn't want to wait. They wanted to live now. But to these treasure hunters, I would say, yes, I found some secret maps. Oh, where? I'm not going to tell you. So there's this, I find there is a cultural obsession with pirates. That, I mean, A lot of calls are just from history buffs, people who just love history. I get calls from people who are, I don't know if you have this in France, but in the US we have something called reenactors. They're people who dress up in the period costume and they act out, the Civil War. There are pirate reenactors now. It's part of people's fantasy life, is it not? Okay, so that's what I want to say in introduction. And what I want to do in this talk today is to invite you to think about pirates in a different way, in an actually historical way, in terms of who these people really were in their own lives, what kinds of choices they made, what they did and what it meant to them. All that, I want to suggest, is much more important than the Hollywood image, than what comes through the movies. Okay? Because beginning in the 1930s, there were a huge number of pirate films, very famous ones, starring someone like Errol Flynn. Captain Blood was one of the most famous of these movies, and they almost always have the same storyline. An aristocrat has been dishonored and is forced to go to sea, come back as a pirate, and recapture his honor and also capture a beautiful woman that he was meant to be with. Okay? Well, that's not the story of most pirates. They were not aristocrats. So the real history, I want to suggest, is more interesting than the fiction, and it's also more important to understanding the world we live in today. Okay, so let me show you a few images and begin that discussion. And let me just mention, I know that many of you will go on to become curators and museum professionals, and you'll be working with documents, okay? I have spent years and years and years poring over the actual documents of piracy. Okay, I mean, reading the order of execution written by a judge that this group of pirates is to be taken to the gallows and hanged. I mean, these documents have a kind of electricity if you think of them in human terms. So I'll intersperse some comments on the use of documents as we talk about this. Okay, I begin with a rather grisly image. This is an image of the hanging of a pirate named Stede Bonnet. He was a pirate captain. This hanging took place in 1719. Now, what I want to tell you about today is not about all pirates in all times. I'm going to concentrate on one specific generation of pirates. And that generation of pirates was in the very early 18th century. They only lasted for about 10 years, from about 1716 to 1726. This is what is often called the golden age of piracy. This is the period where they developed the black flag. This is the period of Blackbeard. This is the period where all of the images that we now have of pirates originated. This generation of pirates created a worldwide crisis. There were thousands of them. My estimate is about 5,000 pirates in various parts of the world just in this small 10-year period at a time when the French or the British Navy might have only 10,000 sailors. So they were a force to be reckoned with, and they caused a crisis by disrupting global trading patterns. by capturing the ships that were so important to European commerce. Okay, so these pirates created a crisis. Because they were interfering with the trade of nations, especially the maritime nations like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Great Britain, and France. Those are the countries that have the big Atlantic empires. They were the ones who suffered the most from the attacks of pirates. Those governments decided, and they actually managed to cooperate on this subject, even though they were at war with each other. They had a common enemy in piracy, and what they decided was, we must capture them and we must hang them. As many of them as we can. Okay? So there is a worldwide campaign to capture and hang pirates. Now, I want to show you that this is not just about their attacks on ships. That's a big, big part of it, because they're capturing the property of very wealthy merchants. And this is enough to make the governments want to eliminate piracy. But there is something else going on here, which is almost never discussed. I'm going to come back to that point, but remember, there's something else going on in addition to the attack on merchant ships. Okay, now, this image can help us to understand what's going on, because every time a pirate was hanged, and this would be, mostly they were hanged in the Americas, in North America, in the Caribbean especially. The Caribbean was the main arena of piracy. Every time a pirate was hanged, there was a big show trial, meaning it was a big deal and everybody came to see it. But everybody who came to see it didn't feel the same way about this idea of hanging the pirates. Because one of the things I discovered in my research is that many common people, working people, did not consider pirates to be criminals. In fact, they were heroes. They were heroes because they dared to fight back against the wealthy people of the day. So, when pirates were captured, like Stede Bonnet's crew, this was in Charleston, South Carolina, they held a big trial, and the rulers of the day wanted to use that trial to teach a lesson. And the lesson was, if you turn pirate and attack the ships that belong to our nation or some other nation, we will hunt you down, we will catch you, and we will hang you. So this was a message that was being sent quite deliberately to all sailors. So notice where the hanging takes place. Notice. Actually, let me get up. Notice, this is the waterfront. These are the masts of ships. There are actually people up here in the crow's nest of a ship. Hangings always took place on the waterfront. Why? Because that's where sailors lived and worked. And the main point of this hanging is to send a message to sailors saying, don't do this. If you do this, we'll kill you. Because these authorities knew that a lot of common sailors had sympathy for the pirates. A famous American minister, a Puritan named Cotton Mather, used to give religious sermons at these hangings. And in one of them he wrote, very revealingly, he said, why do all those people out there watching the hanging consider these vile criminals to be heroes? He was conscious that there was a lot of support for pirates. And this was especially true in South Carolina because several pirates were broken out of jail by their supporters. So it poses a really interesting question for us. Why were they heroes? Why, in fact, did pirates have lots of popular supporters? Why did the government feel the need to use terror? This is terror. They're using terror to try to intimidate sailors from joining pirates if they should ever have the opportunity. Okay? So this waterfront hanging summarizes some very important points about piracy. Okay, so let me tell you how I approached the question of piracy in my research. I started with very simple questions. Very simple questions. Rather than simply asking, what does the government think about piracy, although I studied that too, I asked myself, who were these pirates? Who were they? Where had they come from? What kind of lives did they have? What kind of jobs did they have? Why were they willing to risk their lives? Because they all knew that if they were captured, they would be hanged. Piracy was a very serious offense from the point of view of the government. Why were they willing to take that chance? Well, the traditional answer was gold, that they might get rich with gold and silver and then get away. But I didn't think that was a good enough answer. So I asked, first of all, who are these people? And then I asked the other question, what did they think they were doing? What did it mean to them? When they captured a merchant ship, what did they think about that? It's all fairly simple. So in asking those questions, I had to do a different kind of research that took me beyond the documents of piracy. In other words, I had to look at the world surrounding piracy. Because here's what I found out. The most important finding: pirates were just common, ordinary working sailors. People who worked on merchant ships. People who worked on naval ships. But that group of people had made a decision that they were not going to do that anymore. They were going to become pirates and put their lives on the line. So now I have to go back and study the working life of sailors. What was it like? What did it mean to be a merchant seaman in the early 18th century, or a member of the Royal Navy in the 18th century? That actually led to some very interesting discoveries. Working sailors labored on the most important technology of their day. And this is very important. The ship, the deep sea sailing ship, which you see right behind me, was the most important machine in the rise of global capitalism, in the growth of the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French empires. It was all made possible by what you see right there, by the ship. This is an amazing invention. It's called the Northern European Tall Ship. And what this machine does is that it has cannons, you can see right here. It combines tremendous destructive power with very great mobility so that the European empires can settle in various parts of the world. Okay? You know how I can make this point clear? If you look at the map of the world, any map of the world, and then you look at those 5 countries on the edge of Europe, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, England, and France, that's a very small part of the world's surface, right? and then you think of the parts of the world where those languages are spoken. Where around the world is French spoken? In Africa, in the Caribbean, in South America. English spoken almost universally. Australia, India, West Africa, Spanish, Portuguese, Brazil. Those maritime nations conquered the world, and folks, this is the reason why they were able to do it. That technology made it possible. Now, these things don't run by themselves. You need skilled sailors. So sailors, as workers, are the key to this growth of the world economy. They are a very important part of the rise of Europe around the world. So, in that context, imagine what happens when the ship captains and the merchants begin to lose control of these ships. Those common, ordinary sailors who, because of their work, know how to sail the ships, capture the ships and set up as pirates. This is a very alarming development to the authorities of the day. The most sophisticated machine in the world is now controlled by people who are using it to attack the national and imperial navies and merchant fleets. So you start to see why this is so important. This is a strategic part of the world economy that pirates are now disrupting. They learn how to capture these ships and they know how to sail them. In fact, it was very commonly said that the very best, most skilled sailors were the ones most likely to become pirates. So they were expert sailors. Very important that you know that. Okay, so then the question became, for me as a scholar, what was the working life of a sailor like on a ship like this? What was their life actually like? Well, guess what? I'm sure some of you already know. The life of a sailor in the age of sail was a tremendously difficult life. The wages were low. The food was of very poor quality. Sailors used to say, our bread, our biscuit, right? It moves by itself because it has so many bugs and insects and vermin in it. Right? They go on long voyages. It's very hard to maintain fresh food on these voyages. The pay is bad, the food is bad, and most importantly, for our story, the discipline is extremely harsh. The ship captain, whether a merchant ship or a naval ship, in this period had almost completely unlimited power to discipline his sailors. And floggings, beatings, lashings were very, very common. And that's what you see in this image. This is on a naval ship. You see this right here? I'm going to show you this again. This is called a cat of nine tails. This is a specialized whip used on board these vessels. And this man is having the flesh of his back lashed. Just so you can get a better look. This is one that they have at the National Maritime Museum in Britain. The cords are leather, and they have knots in the end so that the flesh will tear. Okay? Now, you should know that a sailor who is guilty of some offense, like desertion or maybe even mutiny, would be sentenced to 400, 500, 600, 800 or 1,000 lashes. That was a death sentence. You would die from that number of lashes. And to administer that lashes, they would have to have a long line of people who would give you 50 lashes apiece until those people are exhausted and give the whip to somebody else. This, folks, was very common to the life of common sailors. They were beaten routinely. And I'll tell you one story from the archives, okay? This is one of the most chilling moments I ever had as a scholar working in the archives. This happened in the National Archives of Britain. I got a box of documents, big box of documents in the High Court of Admiralty papers. And I opened the box, and lying on top of a stack of 18th century documents was some kind of long black thing. I didn't really know what it was. But I picked it up and I put it aside and I started reading. And it turns out the first case was that of a sailor who was suing his captain in court because his captain had almost beaten him to death with a small piece of rope. And that black thing was the rope, and the blackness was his dried blood. This was a shocking thing to see, but it made real to me the lives of common sailors. These people were beaten and beaten and beaten again, and that, coupled with the low wages, the poor food, and, as a consequence of all three, the very high mortality. Sailors died very young. We don't have the statistics to know exactly how long they lived, but having studied this thing really my whole life, the average deep sea sailor might live 7-8 years working at sea. He might be killed in an accident. He might be killed by his captain. He might catch a disease in some unusual part of the world, like the west coast of Africa, where malaria was a big issue. But sailors died young, and this is really an important fact. Okay? So, this context of low pay, bad food, harsh discipline, and early death, premature death, this is what you must bear in mind when you think about why sailors were willing to become pirates. This is the key. This is the key to understanding that. Now, this is an image of the most famous pirate of this era. He's actually not very well known, although he should be. His name is Bartholomew Roberts, or Black Bart Roberts, as he was called. He and his crew captured about 400 merchant ships. That would be worth millions of dollars or euros by today's standards. They personally captured several hundred. So he is not only probably the key pirate, his ships actually reveal that hidden factor that I mentioned about why the authorities wanted to eliminate piracy. Because here's the key. These exploited, beaten, flogged common sailors who decided they wanted to be pirates, once they organized their own ship, once they had it up to themselves to decide what was going to happen on board their ship, they organized things completely differently than you would find on a naval ship or a merchant ship. They organized their ships completely differently. You know what was the first thing they always did? They elected their captain. They practiced democracy in a time when poor people had no democratic rights whatsoever. none of these common sailors could vote in any election, because voting at that time depended on owning property, and they didn't have any. They were poor. But on their ship, they elected their captain. I think this is fascinating. They also elected somebody else called a quartermaster, whose role it was to keep an eye on the captain to make sure he did not abuse his authority. Because as common sailors, all pirates knew that captains would abuse their authority. So first of all, they elected a captain, and then they elected another guy, say, hey, your job is to keep an eye on him, to make sure he doesn't do that stuff that those other captains do. It's interesting, huh? You start to see things, this is different. Something different is happening. Now, if a captain should do the things that the crew didn't like, he would be immediately deposed by election. They'd gather everybody up on the main deck and they'd say, who wants a new captain? And if a majority said they wanted a new captain, the old captain was out. And if the captain really misbehaved, he might be executed. If he behaved like those other captains that they were trying to escape. Didn't happen a lot, but it did happen on a couple of occasions. So, one of the first characteristics of the pirate social order is democracy. It's a very democratic world. Now, some of the best evidence about this, the historical evidence, comes from merchant captains who were captured by pirates. They frequently wrote about this, sometimes in letters, sometimes in books. And what they always said was, it's not like any other ship I ever saw. The captain has no real power. And they're always voting on everything. And to a ship captain, this was a terrible way to run a ship, right? They were scandalized. They were horrified. But this shows you that pirates were doing everything differently. Okay? Part of this, the captain was not free to flog people. Anytime someone committed an offense, and the pirates did have rules that you had to follow, if someone committed offense, they would gather everybody together and collectively they would decide what the punishment should be. Not the captain. The captain would not decide. The captain would not have the arbitrary power to punish anyone he wanted. The crew would decide. Again, that's democratic. And here's the other thing they did. Now, you would need to know that in the merchant shipping industry and in the Royal Navy, the amount of money that a common sailor made was very, very small. They made very poor wages. But the amount of money that a captain made was enormous. On a naval ship, a captain might make 100 times as much as a common sailor. Sometimes even more. On a merchant ship, it wouldn't be quite that high, but it still would be many dozens of times more money as salary. Okay, so what did pirates do? How did they decide to divide up their money? What they did was very interesting. First thing they did was to abolish the wage. In other words, nobody was a wage worker now. Nobody is paid X amount of money per month. Now, everybody is a shareholder, meaning everybody gets a share of whatever they capture. If they capture a Spanish ship full of gold, everybody gets a share of that gold. And the quartermaster, the man who was elected to keep an eye on the captain, would be usually the person the crew considered the fairest member of the crew. He would be responsible for dividing it up to make sure everybody got a fair allocation. Now here's what's so interesting about it. How much did the common sailor or common pirate get, and how much did the pirate captain get? The common pirate got one share, The captain got 1.5 shares, or maybe 2, but not 100. So they took the wage hierarchy and they compressed it so that the captain got very little more than the crew. And what he got because he had certain skills that everybody else didn't have. He knew navigation. They might give a ship's carpenter a little more, a 1/4 share more. They might give the ship's gunner, the specialist in firing the cannon, a 1/4 share or a 1/2 share more, based on skill. But notice what they've done. They have organized a much more equal way of dividing up their resources. So they practice democracy and they practice equality. And both these things have very interesting effects on other sailors, because what it does, and the pirates are very conscious of this, it makes sailors want to join them. Not only are you going to be free, you're going to elect your own captain. You're going to escape those people who flog you all the time. We will decide if there'll be any flogging. And moreover, you're going to get an equal share of whatever we have. You start to see why it would be attractive to sailors to do it this way. All these things were done on the ships of Bartholomew Roberts. Now, I also want to point out here, you see here, these are some of the very few pirate flags that were created in the actual moment of piracy. So this is actually kind of interesting. And what you see here is it's not just a skull and a crossbones, it's an entire skeleton. And the same is true here. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. And I should also tell you, Black Bart Roberts was working in the slave trade when he joined a pirate ship. A lot of sailors in the slave trade joined pirate ships, partly because the conditions on slave ships were the worst of any, both for the sailors and for the slaves. And what's also interesting is that even though these sailors had been part of the slave trade, they had no problem taking on board black members of the crew. It's kind of fascinating. Pirates were what were called motley crews, meaning multi-ethnic crews. They were notoriously international. On any given pirate ship, you would find English, Irish, French, Dutch, Swedish, and African sailors. Of course, this was true of lots of ships, but it was especially true of pirates. So authorities frequently called them villains of all nations. And they were, in fact, from all nations. They were a very international crew. Okay, I promised you Blackbeard, who is really one of the great figures of this period. Here he is. I have a friend who says that this pose indicates that Blackbeard was gay. I don't know if that's true, but I do want you to know that, let's say, alternative sexualities were encouraged by pirates because a pirate ship was a very free space. And I have seen evidence of lots of consenting relationships among men. It's very common in a single-sex work environment. Anyway, Blackbeard is a fascinating figure. He's a larger-than-life figure. And by that I mean he was conscious of creating an image of himself that would be terrifying to others. So one thing he did was he had this long black beard, right? You see those strands to his beard? It looks almost like dreadlocks, right? Well, when he was also, I should tell you, a very big man in a time when the average height of a man was about 5'5", Blackbeard, or Edward Teach, was 6'2". I'm not sure what that would be in meters. Anyway, I'm tall, right? Comparatively, he would have been like this today. A giant of a man. A giant. Okay? So, he used to scare people by pretending to be the devil. So that, and I love this drama, when he was going into battle, right? When another ship would come alongside and the pirates are going to go into battle and capture that ship, Blackbeard would take sparklers, you know, those fireworks to give off that glow, and he would put them in his beard and all around his head so that his head would have this satanic glow. And people would look at him and they would be terrified, and then they would surrender. You know, we've been caught by the devil himself. Right? So he was very conscious of using imagery to try to scare people. His idea was, whatever you're afraid of, I'm that. I'm your greatest nightmare. Okay? One man met him, found some interesting testimony. One man met him on the docks and says, comes up to him, he says, and who are you? And Blackbeard replied, I'm the devil himself. And the man says, well, where are you going? And he said, well, I'm going back to hell and I'll take you with me. And he runs away, he's scared. Now, here's Blackbeard's flag. Okay, this is a modern reconstruction of it. We do have, I want to show you how what I've said to you about the sailor's life is embedded in the flag. Okay? So this is a skeleton. It's not a very good drawing of a skeleton. It's not as good as the one on Black Bart Roberts. So you can see that's rather a better skeleton right there. And there's another one over there. Anyway, it's a skeleton. And even if it was just a skull and a crossbones, the question is, what did that symbol mean back in that day? It was a symbol of death. The symbol of death. But it had some other specific meanings for pirates. Because when a sailor died at sea, frequently the captain would make a notation in his logbook. What would he draw there? A skull and crossbones. A sailor died. Skull and crossbones. Symbol of death. Well, pirates took that symbolism of death and put it on their flag. But they also added some other symbols. For example, look at this. A human heart. And then a weapon, which is very common. A weapon striking the heart, and these are drops of blood. And notice what's in this hand. You know what that is? That is an hourglass. Okay? So, what are the symbols of the pirate flag? Death, violence, the violence of this spear puncturing a human heart, death, violence, and limited time. Right? Time is running out. Okay, so there are two different meanings to this symbolism. When a pirate flag goes up, let's say there's a merchant ship and the pirates come alongside, they don't know they're pirates until the flag goes up. When the flag goes up, they see the symbolism of death, and the message is surrender or die. If you surrender, we won't kill you. And in fact, it worked. This strategy worked because overwhelmingly other vessels that were approached by pirates just surrendered immediately. First of all, the pirate ships were faster than yours. The pirates were better sailors than you were. They were going to catch you. And if you fight back and they come aboard your ship, they're not going to be happy. So it's just better to give up and hope for the best. And that's what most of them did. Death, violence, and limited time. But notice there's another layer of symbolism. What was the life of the common sailor like? It was violent. It had high mortality, limited time, and it resulted in premature death. So what pirates were doing in creating these flags was commenting in a symbolic way on the life of the common sailor who was trapped on those ships, unable to lead a decent life, dying young, being flogged, given poor food, not given enough money. And so the idea was, as pirates, we can change that. Even if we don't live for very long, we can change that. And many people made the choice to become pirates knowing that they may not live very long, but remember, they thought they weren't going to live very long anyway. So the idea was, if we can be free, and they were very free, as pirates, let's do that. Let's do that. So this symbolism, I think, shows. Now, I've suggested that pirate culture, this egalitarian and democratic pirate culture, actually comes from the life of the common sailor, the experience of working on board the ships. That's the root of it. And I want to illustrate that by showing you something called a round robin. A round robin was an instrument of protest. In other words, what sailors would sometimes do, they wanted to protest something the captain was doing to them. They would draw a circle, such as you see right here, and this one doesn't have it, but inside the circle, they would write a complaint. It might say, the captain is beating us too much. And then they would all sign it, but they would sign it in a circle. They would sign it in a circle so there was no top of the list and no bottom of the list. Because if there's a top of the list, then the captain would say, yeah, you three right here started this petition. Come on. I'm going to flog you. But notice what they did. They very cleverly figured out that if they write in a circle, there's no top and there's no bottom of the list. So what they're doing is, in a very equal way, redistributing the possibilities of death. If he doesn't, it's a fascinating sort of thing. It's also, this is a democratic petition. They're petitioning the authority saying, we want you to change your behavior. We want you to stop flogging us, or we want you to give us better food, right? So my view is that this document, this round robin, summarizes the nature of the culture of common sailors and the culture of pirates. Now, as it happens, this one is not done by sailors, it's done by soldiers. And the truth is, this is done by Dutch soldiers. The truth is, they didn't really know what they were doing. They had heard about this kind of thing that sailors had done, so they decided they wanted to petition their captain. But look, you can see exactly where the first person's name is. It started right here, and it went all the way around. So I bet those three guys got the Dickens whipped out of them. But normally the way sailors would do it is one person writes here, one person writes here, one person writes here, one person writes here, then you fill them in. So that you really can't tell what's the beginning and what's the end of the list, okay? But notice the idea of equality is reflected in the form of the petition. It's really quite interesting. Okay, so that, I guess, is my point. This is a drawing by Howard Pyle, an American artist who I think really understood pirates. What does it all add up to? Well, it's a different interpretation of pirates, which stresses not just violence and greed, but stresses instead the social life of sailors and why people made the decision to become pirates. And the same point can be made not only by reading the flag of the pirates, but by looking at that image that we started with, of the eye patch, the hook for a hand, and the peg leg. That image actually expresses something very important about the life of the common working sailor. And what it says is that it was a very dangerous line of work. Sailors were very frequently injured, maimed. We've talked about premature death. Well, here's something you must think about. Imagine two wooden ships side by side engaged in combat, firing their cannons at each other, okay? What happens when a cannonball hits a wooden ship at high velocity? An explosion of splinters, wooden splinters. They hit you in the eye. A chunk of wood carries off your hand. A bigger chunk of wood carries off your leg. So these kinds of accidents were very common. Therefore, sailors in every port city of the world, in Nantes, in London, in Port Royal, Jamaica, sailors would have been the most common beggars you would find. And one would be missing a leg, and one would be missing an arm, and one would be blind. And they would be begging because their jobs destroyed their bodies. Being a sailor was very hard physical work, and you would be prematurely disabled or killed. Now, pirates also thought about this, okay? And here's something that I think will really surprise you. Pirates created a welfare state on board their ship. And one of the things they said was, anybody who is injured while fighting a battle as a pirate, if you lose a hand, we're going to give you 5,000 extra pieces of gold. If you lose a leg, we'll give you 8,000 extra pieces of gold. It's fascinating. It's like they had the idea that we have to care for the people who are injured in our line of work. So they even created social democracy on board the pirate ship. I bet you didn't think of pirates as democratic, egalitarian, social democrats, did you? No, I don't think you did. But these are the things they were doing. And folks, we come back now to the main point. This is a reason why the authorities of the day felt they had to execute them. It was certainly that they were attacking merchants, but they were also demonstrating that you could run a ship in a democratic, egalitarian way. And this was profoundly threatening to the merchant and naval captains and all of the merchants of the day. This was seditious. This was demonstrating that a captain didn't have to beat his sailors, didn't have to starve his sailors, didn't have to bilk the wages of the sailors, that in fact the ship could be run in a very democratic, progressive way. And the power of that subversive example, the authorities felt they had to eliminate. The idea was too popular among common sailors. The idea was too attractive. So therefore, they had to basically execute as many pirates as they could and eliminate this as an option of a different way of living. So, when we love pirates today, partly we love their costumes. Partly we love the fact that as children we grew up with them. Partly we love because they're just kind of fascinating characters. But I want to submit to you, one of the reasons we love them is because we know that deep in their hearts they were rebels. They tried to live differently. They fought back against injustice as common sailors experienced it. And I think we still know that at some level. And I think that is part of the reason why we love pirates so much. Okay, thank you. Okay, we have time for discussion, do we not? Yes, we can take some questions. Yes.
The language they spoke.
Yes.
They were making
Yes. You know, this was a problem for all ships because these crews would be multinational. And inevitably what happened is that there was a working language of the ship. If a majority of the pirates were English, English would be the working language. If a majority of the pirates were French, French would be the working language. That would depend. And what's really interesting is that all the authorities assumed that the English pirates and the French pirates would fight each other, but they didn't. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? They didn't. They also assumed that the Protestant pirates would hate the Catholic pirates, but they didn't. They managed to get along. But everybody would have to learn the vocabulary of orders for a ship, about how to adjust the sails, how to haul the ropes. These would be worked out basically by, well, most people had worked on ships in which there were different languages anyway. So sailors were very multilingual because they spent their lives working in this polyglot community. But there would be a single language that would be the language in which the captain would give the orders about how to sail the ship and how to fight a battle. Yes?
Thank you for a fascinating talk, Professor. In this emancipated environment, I noticed you haven't said anything about the women.
Yes.
It's a twofold question. So
Okay.
what evidence have you seen in your research about women? And also, I think the stereotype of women on ships, that they were prostitutes or they being passed around the crew. But what have you seen any evidence of female agents, real individual agents, acting as equal crew members?
My sincere apologies for not telling you about the two most interesting pirates of the Golden Age. Their names are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. And I wrote a chapter about them in one of my books. Actually, this is a book called Villains of All Nations. It does exist in a French translation, so you can read this chapter about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, although you can probably read it in English too. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were, one, Anne Bonny, an Irish, and Mary Read, an English woman. They both dressed as men and went to sea. For different reasons. Mary Read did it because she fell in love with a fellow sailor. Mary Read did it because she didn't have any other opportunities. And it turns out, the scholarship shows that there were quite a few women dressed as men on board these ships. And you might find that surprising, but you know, on a ship, people didn't take their clothes off. And a lot of these women were working class women who were very strong, able to do the work. So the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and they were actually very famous in their day, very famous. They became pirates, and basically they earned the respect of their crew members by doing the work, by fighting, by going up the mast to set the sail. They were both very athletic and very strong. At a certain point, they decided that they were going to let the men know that they were women. And they did. And the men were shocked, but they accepted it. They accepted their presence because they had earned their respect. Well, that meant that sometimes when they were attacking a vessel, they would dress as men, but then later they would dress as women. And some of the prisoners they took saw them dressed as women. And when those prisoners were released, they went back to wherever they came from and said, "My God, there are these women pirates out there," and there are newspaper articles about them published in various places. So this is well known. They were captured. Their whole ship was captured. They were taken to Jamaica. They were put on trial. All of them were condemned to death. And just as the sentence of death was passed, Mary Read and Anne Bonny said to the judge, "My lord, we plead our bellies." They were both pregnant. And English law would not allow a pregnant woman to be hanged. So their shipmates were all executed, including Anne Bonny's lover, Jack Rackham, who was the captain of that crew. And I'll just tell you one quick story about Jack and Anne. When their ship was captured, it happened at a time when quite a number of the crew were drunk. So they were in a kind of foggy sea, and this naval vessel came up, and they didn't see it until the last minute. And when it came up alongside and started firing cannons, several of the pirates, including Jack Rackham, the captain, got frightened and went down into the hold of the ship. Whereas Anne Bonny and Mary Read and 2 other men stayed up on the deck to fire cannons back to try to defend themselves. Well, they were overmatched and they were captured, they were taken in. But when Jack Rackham went to the gallows and was to be hanged, he looked at his sweetheart, Anne Bonny, right there at the gallows. She's not being executed, but she's there. And he looks at her in this sort of loving way, and she says, this is taken down at the scene, she says, "Jack, don't look at me like that, because if you had fought like a man, you wouldn't now be hanged like a dog." Anne Bonny was tough. Okay, now, one story about Mary Read. She also fell in love with a fellow pirate, and one day that fellow pirate was challenged to a duel by another pirate who was a much tougher character. Pirates had this thing whereby if 2 people got into a dispute, they wouldn't fight on the ship, they would go ashore and have a duel. And they would start with a pistol, and then if the pistol missed, and usually they did in those days, they'd pull their swords, and the first one to draw blood would be declared the winner. And it would take it off the ship and symbolically off the sea. So Mary Read's sweetheart has been challenged to a duel by this other member of the crew, and Mary Read is absolutely sure that he's going to be killed. There's no doubt in her mind that he's going to be killed because this other guy is too much for him. So what does she do? She picks a fight with that same tough guy, challenges him to a duel to take place 1 hour before the other duel. She scheduled it this way. And in the duel, she shot him dead on the spot and saved her lover. Now, what they didn't know, Mary Read had worked as a soldier in the British Army in the continent. She was really good with weapons, right? So this guy was really messing with the wrong person's boyfriend. So those are 2 stories about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Just to let you know how it ended, neither one of them was ever executed. Mary Read died in prison of probably typhoid fever, which was very common in those prison settings. And Anne Bonny, whose father was a wealthy merchant, was somehow freed and disappeared. We don't know what happened to her, but one of these days I'm gonna find her. So yes, women pirates, and very important women pirates, and very well known in their own day. Yes.
I had a question about women. Do you think they were responsible not to be captains?
Well, they were not elected captains. No, that's a good question. They were not elected captains because neither one of them knew navigation. The captain needed to know how to navigate a ship. But what's very interesting to me is that they both did play leadership roles on the ship. In other words, one of the most important things that could be allocated on a pirate crew is who is going to lead the boarding party when you go aboard a prize ship. And Anne Bonny and Mary Read would frequently be appointed to do that. So that shows that they were very well respected as fighters, and also that they were very committed to the cause. Right? You had to believe that people you were going to put in those positions of authority were really committed pirates. And so they basically did that. Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for this update and explaining why your crew doesn't stop ringing.
Thank you.
I want to suggest to maybe your discussion, to suggest before it doesn't stop ringing, because the image is very producing. is very appealing
Yeah.
to a certain type of audience, so not only professional actors, but
Yes.
generally the American section, the way that you want to construct your identity is related to this universal activity now about our democracy, so innate notions of democracy, of equality, the gender, so we just have just, it's just for technical reasons that the ladies in question were not captured. So I'm a little bit puzzled by this reproduction or reinforcement of this idea of American life, which is very comparable to the American Indian in the far west and the south. And also this
Interesting.
Sort of wilderness, where actually what emerges is the innate qualities of human nature, which are as we imagine it to be. Everything we organize about the requiring sense, and there's a whole pattern of construction like this. And likewise, in other cases of piracy or theft and looting, I'm thinking of Robin Hood, the notion of the sort of proximity between the popular, which you're talking about, this popular ideals that are used in the fight against the hegemony of the power. So maybe, I mean, now that you give us one way of the story, maybe there's another way.
Definitely.
That will explain.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
And then critical element, just how.
Yes. No, it's a very good question. I want to go back to Black Bart Rogers. In the book that I've written, one of the arguments I make is that pirates are very much like Robin Hood and other types of social bandits. Eric Hobsbawm developed this idea. A social bandit is someone who breaks the law but is not really considered to be a criminal by others because there's some social or political content, an element of protest to what they're doing. And so in this sense, the pirate is like many other outlaws. In the United States, the James brothers, Jesse and Frank James, were considered these sorts of outlaw heroes. In terms of the pirates, the connection is quite literal, because I found evidence that in one case, a captured merchant said that when the pirate's ship came alongside his, which is already surrendered, he said the pirates came up on deck and started chanting, "We are Robin Hood's men." They were conscious of that connection. We are Robin Hood's men. Now, of course, they robbed from the rich and they gave it to themselves, right? So it's a self-serving idea of the poor. But there's no doubt in my mind that the popularity of pirates is part of this romance of the outlaw. And I think the cowboy sort of fits into the same, it's a very good comparison to Native Americans. These are people who sort of live on the margins in some freer way. So there is this ideological element to the attraction to pirates. And I think some of that is reflected in the Hollywood films and some of it is not. But my guess is that most people do have, as I've said, this sense that pirates were opposed to the establishment of their day. And I think lots of people like to imagine themselves as being opposed to the establishment in this day. So where do we go with that?
Well, question is,
Yes.
what is your role as a historian?
Yes. Okay.
As a principle, is supposed not to reproduce or to eliminate myths, but actually to question
Yeah.
the foundation of society in general, particularly.
Yeah. Of course.
Contradictions between.
Well, I should say first of all that even though myth has grown up around pirates, what I've told you is based on years of documentary research. In other words, that we can go to the documents to show you we're Robin Hood's men. The thing I was going to point out about Rogers and his crew, one of the things pirates did, and this is more proof of their social banditry, is that when they captured a ship, they would frequently go aboard with that boarding party, and before they started plundering anything, they would line up the sailors of the captured ship. They would have the captain right there, their prisoner, and they would say to the sailors, How does your captain treat you? Now, this is quite a moment. How does your captain treat you? Now, the sailors on that ship have got to make a choice. If they're going to say something against their captain, they better not stay on board his ship. But when someone steps up and says, our captain beats us unfairly, our captain bilks our wages, our captain doesn't give us proper food, that captain is in a lot of trouble. Because pirates would act as avengers on behalf of these common sailors. Now, bear in mind, they're also using this dramatic moment to recruit. Because the moment it's over, and if they might end up whipping that captain, and in some cases they actually executed captains. And they would say, okay, who wants to come with us on board the pirate ship? And that's how people frequently made the decision. So it's in that act of revenge, and revenge is a very crucial motive for pirates, that they actually gain ever greater numbers, and this is why they're becoming an ever larger threat. So it's fascinating to me that the kind of wrath against the previous conditions is part of what they're doing. And I think, Rogers actually had a member of his crew who had a specific job title, dispenser of justice. And his job was to whip the ship captains who had mistreated their crews. Now, it also worked the other way around. If the crew said, our captain is a good man, our captain treats us well, the pirates would not only not punish him, they would frequently give him his ship back, and they might even give him money. There's a fascinating example of this. A captain named William Snellgrave, who was captured by pirates, and wrote about this at great length. And he said that once my crew spoke up for me and said that I was a good man, an honest man, as they said, I was treated very, very well. So what they told him, they said, okay, we're going to give you this money. They gave him money. Go back to London and show the merchants there what happens when someone treats their sailors well. This is a very interesting consciousness. Okay, so, but to come back to your question of my role as a historian, my role as a historian is to try to show that there have been instances in which working people not only resisted the social order in which they found themselves, but actually posed concrete solutions to it. This way of running a ship was a major innovation. Fascinating. Scared the ruling orders of the day. Had to be eliminated. There are lots of examples of that kind of thing. I mean, so my job as a historian is to talk about a version of history from below, how ordinary people have been part of history, how they made history, how that history has been hidden by the dominant narratives of great men. So all of my books are history from below, whether it's the history from below of the slave ship, of the pirate ship, of the Amistad Rebellion. They're all about the same thing. It's about recovering, use the word agent, recovering the agency of people who are not usually considered to be makers of history. That's my main role, to try to show that our history is more complicated and that ordinary working people have had a much greater role in it than we thought, given the way history was written for so long with a completely elite bias. That the only people you really need to know about are George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. I want to know about George Washington's soldiers and Thomas Jefferson's slaves. How are they part of the story?
After this golden age, what has become of piracy?
Well, it's a very good question. Piracy is basically eliminated as an international coherent movement in the later 1720s. Now, there will be sporadic and small-scale acts of piracy ever after, and including today. in Somalia, as you know, where there's been a big outbreak of piracy. So it has never been something that could be eliminated altogether. But the thing that was eliminated was this kind of mass movement of piracy, where the crisis was created. What that did in another book I wrote, I've described the way in which the traditions of what I call maritime radicalism are forced below deck. In other words, they can't take the form of piracy anymore, but they crop up in other ways. And one of the places where they crop up again is in the American Revolution, which is about 40 years later, where sailors play a leading role in articulating a lot of the new ideas of liberty that will be important not only in the American Revolution, but in the whole age of revolution. French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, sailors play a very important role in all of this. So it's a lot of my work is about what we might call the hidden history of maritime radicalism, of how the ideas are suppressed at one point, but they pop back up again. And that's the kind of thing I've been studying for a long time in all of its manifestations. And there are class issues, there are race issues, there are gender issues, and I think this is, we need to think about this. You know, we need to think about the old view is that Jefferson had all the ideas of liberty. It's not true. It's not true. First of all, even if he did, he couldn't fight the war. So who's fighting the war and what are their ideas of liberty? But I also found, you know, everyone knows this famous line in the Declaration of American Independence that people have inalienable rights and that all men are created equal. Okay? I found the origin of that phrase. It happened in a sailors' riot in Boston in 1747, where there was an armed battle because the British Navy was impressing sailors, and sailors went into the streets and fought. And a man named Sam Adams, who will become a leader in the Revolutionary era, writes, "These riots show that all people are created equal, born with natural rights." And this was actually, he was moved to articulate this idea by the actions that sailors were taking in the streets. So you can even trace the ideas at the highest level of intellectual history back to the actions taken by people from below. And so in some ways, it's a way of thinking, rethinking some of those ideas themselves and where they came from and what they meant to people, and why sailors were so willing to fight for the cause of American independence, in which they played a major role. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.